Come to work so my peoples come
I
first.
got worldwide family all over the earth, and I worry about them all for whatever it's worth.
I think this conversation in some ways is a continuation of a discussion that I had in a fireside chat format with Stephen Half previously as part of a BSIC event. And this was kind of in the pre-COVID era as we were starting to think about, what were the implications following Davos and all of these significant global commitments around emissions reductions activities and journeys towards carbon neutral or carbon negative in some circumstances. And so a lot of the momentum that was driven from Davos and kind of the output of a lot of the conversations from that 2020 cycle came to a headway in many different contexts as COVID started to set in. And we started to see a lot of conversations, obviously, around the resiliency of supply chains and how organizations would go about, thinking through the resiliency model of the future and how they could digitize and both understand, the risks that they were inherently exposed to as it related to concentration of specific supply chain elements within jurisdictions that might, be subject to a risk like a pandemic. And so as these conversations kind of came together in the middle of 2020, we started to think about, and started having a series of conversations with our clients around, what does it mean to think about a data-driven approach to transformation of not just kind of the decarbonization agenda for supply chains that we've been advancing for some time, but also to think about broader resiliency as it relates to factors like COVID and pandemics and trade blocks, but also thinking about overlaying and using data to better understand some of the ethical considerations around production and supply chains that are near and dear to investors and capital markets. And so the conversation that started in Davos really, kind of in some ways, there were questions as to whether or not the momentum that we gained and kind of critical mass that we achieved would continue in the wake of the pandemic. And I think our work over the last 9 months has really told us in many ways that it is, that the conversation is continuing at the highest levels, that organizations are striving to walk the walk and to be able to do that, as Padmini mentioned, in verifiable and trusted ways. And so the conversation continues today, and I'll talk a little bit about how we're seeing blockchain unfold as a trust mechanism for these carbon neutral, carbon negative journeys. But in doing so, I think we're also looking at now how to think about the approaches from an IoT, from a data perspective, that we're looking at for decarbonization, and also overlaying core data that's relevant to decisioning over ethical supply chains and other considerations around COVID type or edge case type resiliency. So as Minnie set up the conversation today, she spoke a little bit about the work that we're doing at KPMG. And I think there's basically 3 verticals that we're applying blockchain to solve for issues in the space. And I think the conversation, as I pivot towards the end, we'll move quickly into a discussion with Bill Kentrup from All Infra and bring to life some of the things that I'm describing as I talk here. So in the first pillar, we're looking at how to use blockchain to create trust in environmental data. So we've got, over the last 15 years, an explosion in the amount of information that's generated around the physical world and the physical environment. And so the approach now is thinking about how do we harness that data in trusted ways, capture that information, and then make it available for higher level business decisioning that is either through the enterprise purview or in the context of reporting to investors, stakeholders, and capital markets. And so the first core use case that we've deployed blockchain as part of our climate accounting infrastructure solution at KPMG is really at the core and foundation of that data capture, where we're looking at very deep integrations in specific industry verticals, all the way down into, in the context of real estate, the BMS or building management system infrastructure, to understand the carbon consumption and cryptographically capture that information at the source. And so what we're doing in this first use case is essentially creating a provable, verifiable audit trail of all of the data that then drives the calculations for different factors and reporting as you think about scope 1 and 2 emissions. And so in this first use case, we're really looking at how to create cryptographically auditable systems for non-financial information, starting with carbon, and then looking at how we can build reporting for different organizational stakeholders, different regulators, and in some cases, the public as well. So the second use case and kind of extending that primitive is looking at how do you think about the footprint of a specific enterprise or specific asset within an enterprise, and then offset that footprint. And so the conversation quickly becomes, how do I create and integrate what might be investments into on-site renewable generation next to a large campus, or some type of carbon capture technology that may be facilitating true offset of carbon for scope 1. And so building this integrated network around kind of the carbon management of an organization is something that we're working to solve for in multiple industry segments right now. And the conversation, as I move forward from here, really pivots into the capital markets discussion. And so this is the piece where, you know, I'd love to pass it off to Bill Kentrup in just a moment, in that the piece around connecting what is a carbon footprint of an organization to the supply side from an offset perspective, and then thinking about an ecosystem viewpoint of how do the capital markets intersections points play out with regards to forming capital to invest into sustainable infrastructure projects, or, you know, actually looking at additionality from some type of renewable generation or carbon capture technology, and cryptographically capturing that again, improving it. And so I'll pass it off to Bill briefly to run through a quick demo, to run through a quick set of slides that show you a blockchain-enabled solution that allows for climate-friendly asset owners to realize maximum value as they're mitigating their climate effect, and for looking at climate financiers who are seeking to meet their climate goals.